Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
It would take Oppenheimer 41 years before he stood at the base of the world's first ever nuclear detonation. But from the beginning, it was almost destiny. J. Robert Oppenheimer was born in New York City in April 1904. His parents were wealthy German immigrants who knew hardship and valued education. Oppenheimer was born at the peak of his parents' success, and his childhood was spent in an upper-class area of Manhattan. He thrived in this environment, skipping entire grades in grade school and supplementing his free time with independent studies. Upon graduating, he was accepted into Harvard, where he began his college education. 3 years later, he graduated with a degree in chemistry. He attended the University of Cambridge for a short time after that. He realized his passion lay in physics, and their laboratory was valuable for his studies. However, Oppenheimer was known for his bold personality, and it didn't mix well with his professor, J.J. Thomson. As their tension began to rise, Oppenheimer received a letter from Max Born, an accomplished physicist and mathematician. The letter was an invitation to the University of Göttingen, the world's leading center for theoretical physics. He accepted without delay, and it was in Germany that he began to make a name for himself. He graduated with his doctorate in 1927 at 23 years old. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was recovering from the aftermath of World War I. The League of Nations had been formed as a peacekeeping measure, and appeasement policies were putting pressure on the losing countries. Everything that was made to prevent the world from crumbling again was doing the opposite. These actions, combined with the rise of totalitarian leadership in Japan and Germany, were plunging the world back into conflict. The rumbles were first felt in the political sphere, but it wasn't long before the scientific community was feeling the pressure. Whispers of war were ignored as scientists continued to dedicate themselves to their craft. Hahn and Strassmann discovered nuclear fission, while Oppenheimer diligently studied quantum theory, which had been announced only a few years prior. And then it began. Poland's borders were breached, and the Second World War was upon us. The terrified words of Einstein caused Oppenheimer's research to pivot. Mankind will surely fall if the Nazis are the first to build a nuclear weapon. Oppenheimer began seeking a process for separating uranium-235 from natural uranium. This, he knew, would be important for constructing such a bomb. But even more important was the question: how much uranium would be needed to create a nuclear warhead? One early morning in 1942, Oppenheimer heard a knock at his door. He opened it and saw a small letter lying on his doorstep. Upon reading it, he felt his heart grow cold, but his chest fluttered with excitement. He had received an invitation from General Leslie Groves, a prominent member of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, who had overseen the construction of the Pentagon. And now he was inviting Oppenheimer to a secret location, with discretion urged in every sentence. Oppenheimer arrived at the location, flashing his invitation as proof of admission. Here he met General Groves and learned that the U.S. was in a desperate race against Germany to be the first to build an atomic bomb. Oppenheimer's knowledge would be invaluable to the cause. While he had previously been a communist sympathizer, his ties to the cause had long since been severed, and he knew what was at stake if the Nazis were to win the race. With a nod and a handshake, his part in the Manhattan Project was solidified. Oppenheimer moved to New Mexico and became the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory, where the greatest minds from across Europe and the United States had been assembled. The team he oversaw consisted of a few hundred scientists, and their first task was determining the most efficient process for isotope separation. Initially, there were doubts about whether he was right for the job. Oppenheimer was known for his sour nature, and his lack of administrative experience left many wondering if the project would fall apart under his leadership. But Oppenheimer was clever. He was once quoted as saying he needed physics more than friends, and that saying summed up his experience as a director. He was efficient, and even if his methods left his coworkers frowning or upset, he always ensured that the job got done. Oppenheimer's team was able to settle on an isotope separation process. However, their first bump in the road came 6 months after the initiation of the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer sat down with the top scientists involved in the project and laid out the facts. The revelation was quick and cold. Twice the amount of fissionable material would be required for the bomb than had been estimated initially. The room was silent. General Groves was the first to break the silence, frustrated and questioning why this was something that hadn't been accounted for from the beginning. While the burst of emotion irritated Oppenheimer, he understood Groves' anxiety. The military thought more than one bomb would be needed to win the war. This revelation was catastrophic. From this point on, Groves and Oppenheimer's relationship began to splinter. Oppenheimer didn't like how Groves oversaw the Manhattan Project. Under his leadership, interdepartmental communication was off limits, and travel between different sites and buildings was prohibited without the proper reasoning and credentials. These regulations frustrated Oppenheimer, whose team had grown from a few hundred scientists to thousands of people working under his scope. Limits in communication were there to prevent secrets from being spilled, but it was impossible to solve complex issues without being able to talk to other teams. So, Oppenheimer ignored the rules. He did what he needed to do to get the job done. Groves didn't like it, but the government allowed it. Oppenheimer was integral to the project's success, even if national security was being put at risk. But behind Oppenheimer's confident mask was fear. What if he failed the people whose trust had been placed in him? He struggled with the thought of the bomb. He knew that if he succeeded, thousands of people would die, millions would be affected, the world would change forever. On July 16, 1945, the anxious group huddled inside the cramped bunker, their eyes turned outward toward the slender window of reinforced glass. And then, there came the explosion. The white-hot light was the first thing. It blinded them, and then the bunker shook with a force the world had never experienced. Oppenheimer lowered his hand, staring past the starbursts that danced across his eyes. He watched the mushroom cloud climb higher into the sky, the smoke and debris blocking the sun. After the explosion, Oppenheimer left the small bunker and met with his superiors. The Trinity test had been successful. The first detonation of a nuclear weapon had gone off without a hitch. But the truth was, despite the successful test, Oppenheimer didn't feel happy. The Axis powers suffered devastating losses and were losing footholds in conquered territories. Germany had recently announced an unconditional surrender, and no one knew what Japan would do next. Time was running out to use the atomic bomb. The first attack was launched on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was dropped by the U.S. aircraft named Enola Gay. The second atomic bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. The B-29 bomber named Bockscar carried out the mission. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki led to Japan's surrender, effectively ending World War II. But there was no celebrating for Oppenheimer. Instead, a single thought loomed over his head. 214,000 people. 140,000 were from Hiroshima and 74,000 from Nagasaki. They were killed in the blast and in the decades that followed by cancer, leukemia, debilitating side effects from the radiation. Survivors recount seeing people, almost zombies, wandering down the streets. Children watched once healthy people collapse in front of their destroyed homes for no apparent reason. What they didn't know was that those people were experiencing massive cell death and their bodies were rotting from the inside out. The detonation of the bombs on innocent people sent waves of anger through the scientific community, which had always favored a demonstrative use of the bombs, detonating them over the ocean instead of over families. Oppenheimer dealt with the guilt of his involvement for the rest of his life. His morning walks were plagued with the thought of destroyed buildings and separated families. But instead of letting it destroy him, it motivated him. He sat down with U.S. President Truman and discussed the implications of nuclear weapons. No war was worth using bombs that would permanently change the world. He continued to advocate for nuclear peace and spoke out against the construction of the hydrogen bomb. But his usefulness had run out, and his voice was no longer heard. Edward Teller, a former co-worker known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, testified against Oppenheimer, claiming he had always been a Nazi sympathizer and that the integrity of his character would always be tainted. At the end of everything, Oppenheimer's security clearance was revoked. He became an academic exile, cut off from all the resources he needed to continue his work. With his career coming to an abrupt end, Oppenheimer chose to spend more time with his family. He bought a small plot of land in the Virgin Islands and spent months at a time there, sailing with his wife and daughter. He alternated between the beach and giving lectures at prominent institutions, educating others about the impact nuclear weapons could have on the world. Oppenheimer was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1965. He spent his last 2 years at home with his family until he passed away at the age of 62. While many debate the morality of the father of the atomic bomb, it is unanimously agreed that Oppenheimer held a love for his work that not many experience. His legacy calls for us to remember morality in everything we do. Not can we, but should we? What are your thoughts on the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer? Let us know in the comments below. See you in the next one.